The land walls in which Byzantium put its trust during that fateful spring of 1453 ran from the source of the Marmara to the upper reaches of the Golden Horn, forming the western boundary of the city. They were already more than 1,000 years old, known as the Theodosian Walls, after the Emperor Theodosius II, in whose reign they were built. They were in fact completed in 413, when he was still a child. In terms of medieval siege warfare, they were impregnable. Any attacking army had first to negotiate a deep ditch some 60 feet across, much of which could be flooded to a depth of about 30 feet in an emergency. Beyond this was a low crenellated breastwork with a terrace behind it about 30 feet wide. Then the outer wall, 7 feet thick and nearly 30 feet high, with 96 towers at regular intervals along it. Within these walls ran another broad terrace, and then the principal element of the defense, the great inner wall, about 16 feet thick at the base and rising to a height of 40 feet above the city. It too had 96 towers, alternating in position with those of the outer bastion. The result was almost certainly the most formidable municipal fortification constructed in the Middle Ages. But the Middle Ages were past. Over the next 8 weeks, the Sultan subjected those walls to a bombardment unprecedented in the history of siege warfare. Behind makeshift wooden stockades, the defenders worked ceaselessly to repair the damage, but it was clear that they could not continue to do so indefinitely. Only one of their defenses seemed immune from any onslaught that the enemy could launch against it: the great chain which stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn from a tower just below the Acropolis on what is now Seraglio Point to another on the sea walls of Galata. A few days after the siege began, the Turkish admiral had led a number of his heaviest ships to ram it, but it had held firm. It was one of the Sultan's characteristics that he would suddenly focus all his attention on a single objective, which he would pursue obsessively until it was gained. By the middle of April, his mind was fixed on control of the Golden Horn. The method by which he proposed to achieve it seems barely credible to us today. He set his engineers to work on a road running behind Galata, from a point on the Bosporus shore over the hill near what is now Taksim Square and down to the Golden Horn at Kasimbasha. Iron wheels had been cast, and metal tracks. His carpenters, meanwhile, had been busy fashioning wooden cradles large enough to accommodate the keels of medium-sized vessels. On Sunday morning, 22nd April, the Genoese colony in Galata watched dumbfounded as some 70 Turkish ships were slowly hauled by innumerable teams of oxen over a 200-foot hill and then lowered gently down again into the Horn. By the beginning of May, the emperor knew that he could not hold out much longer. One hope only remained: a relief expedition from Venice. Was there a fleet on its way or not? If so, how big was it, and what was its cargo? Most important of all, how soon would it arrive? On the answers to these questions, the whole fate of Constantinople now depended. And so it was that just before midnight on the 3rd of May, a Venetian brigantine flying a Turkish standard and carrying a crew of 12 volunteers, all disguised as Turks, slipped out under the boom. On the night of the 23rd, it returned, pursued by an Ottoman squadron. Fortunately, Venetian seamanship was still a good deal better than Turkish, and soon after nightfall it succeeded in entering the Horn. The captain immediately sought an audience with the emperor. For 3 weeks, he reported, he had cruised through the Aegean. Nowhere had be seen had he seen a trace of the promised expedition, or indeed of any Venetian shipping. When he realized that it was useless to continue the search, he had called a meeting of the sailors and asked them what they should do. One had advocated sailing home to Venice, arguing that Constantinople was probably already in Turkish hands, but he had been shouted down. To all the rest, their duty was clear. They must report back to the emperor, as they had promised to do. And so they had returned, knowing full well that they would probably never leave the city alive. Constantine thanked each one personally, his voice choked with tears. On 26 May, the Sultan held a council of war. The siege, he told those around him, had continued long enough. The time had come for the final assault. The following day would be given over to preparations. The day after that, to rest and prayer. The attack would begin in the early hours of Tuesday, 29 May. No attempt was made to conceal the plan from the defenders within the city. Some of the Christians in the Turkish camp even shot arrows over the walls with messages informing them of Mehmed's intentions. But such measures were hardly necessary. The frenzied activity, day and night, in the Turkish camp told its own story. On the last Monday of the empire's history, the people of Constantinople, including their emperor, left their houses and gathered for one last collective intercession. As the bells pealed out from the churches, all the most sacred icons and the most precious relics were carried out to join the long, spontaneous procession of Greeks and Italians, Orthodox and Catholic alike, that wound its way through the streets and along the whole length of the walls. By the time it was finished, dusk was falling. From all over the city, as if by instinct, the people were making their way to the Church of the Holy Wisdom. For the past 5 months, the building had been generally avoided by the Greeks, defiled as they believed it to be by the Latin usages that no pious Byzantine could possibly accept. Now, for the first and last time, liturgical differences were forgotten. St. Sophia was, as no other church could ever be, the spiritual center of Byzantium. In this moment of supreme crisis, there could be nowhere else to go. The service was in progress when the emperor arrived to take communion with his subjects. Much later, when all but the few permanent candles had been put out and the great church was in darkness, he slipped back in and spent some time alone in prayer. Then he returned to the walls. He had no sleep that night, for Mehmed did not wait for dawn to launch his assault. At 1:30 in the morning, he gave the signal. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered. The blasts of trumpets and the hammering of drums, combining with the blood curdling Turkish war cries, to produce a clamor fit to waken the dead. At the same time, the bells of all the churches in Constantinople began to peal, a sign to the whole city that the final battle had begun. The attacks came in wave after wave. First, the irregular bazooks, untrained and with little staying power, but readily expendable and ideal for demoralizing the defenders and making them easier victims for the more sophisticated fighters that would follow them. Then the regiments of Anatolian Turks, fully trained and superbly disciplined, pious Muslims to a man and determined to win eternal rewards in paradise by being the first to enter the greatest city in Christendom. Finally, the Janissaries, advancing across the plain at the double, their ranks unbroken and dead straight despite all the missiles that the defenders could hurl against them. Soon after dawn, a bolt struck Giovanni Giustiniani Longo and smashed through his chest. Confusion spread through the ranks of the Genoese, many of whom fled, but by now it hardly mattered. Within an hour, the Turks had made a breach in the wall and were streaming into the city. The emperor, seeing that all was lost, plunged into the fray where the fighting was thickest. He was never seen again. By now it was morning, with the waning moon high in the sky. The hours that followed were horrible indeed. By noon, the streets of Constantinople were running red with blood. Houses were ransacked, women and children raped and impaled, churches razed, icons wrenched from their golden frames, books ripped from their silver bindings. In the Church of the Holy Wisdom, matins were already in progress when the berserk conquerors were heard approaching. The poorer and more unattractive of the congregation were massacred on the spot. The remainder lashed together and led off to the Turkish camps for their captors to use as they liked. The officiating priests continued with the Mass for as long as possible before being slaughtered where they stood, at the high altar. There are, among the Orthodox faithful, those who still believe that at the last moment one or two of them gathered up the most precious of the sacred vessels and mysteriously disappeared with them into the southern wall of the sanctuary. There they will remain until the day Constantinople becomes once again a Christian city, when they will resume the liturgy at the point at which it was interrupted.